Good evening. Good evening. Little distraction. Welcome to our weekly program, Tzutzos Parsha, Sparks of the weekly Torah portion, tidbits. Each one of these can develop into an hour lecture, but we want to focus on giving you just small snippets of Torah knowledge pertaining to the weekly Torah portion, but also knowledge that has some lessons for us, because Torah could be studied in a theoretical sense, but you get the most out of it when you could apply it to your own life. Well, this is the second year of our series. I looked up in my notes that we spoke about this parsha of Noach last year, so I'll try to include other things that we did not speak about last year. Every now and then I might repeat an idea that I think is central. The Torah portion begins with the three words, Eila Toldos Noach. These are the offspring or the generations of Noach. Then it goes on to describe him. Noach, Ish Tzadik. Noach was a righteous man. Now, I just want to share with you an amusing anecdote. When I first studied this in school, some 61 years ago, and I'm only 39, so try to figure that out. 61 years ago, I went to this school, and they translated everything from the text in Yiddish and then in English. So we started with the text in Hebrew, translated into Yiddish, and then from Yiddish into English. Now here the Torah uses the word Noach twice. These are the offspring of Noach. Noach was a righteous man. So this is how they taught me this verse. And I'm not going to translate the first two words. We get to the word Noach. They would translate Noach. Now how do you translate Noach in Yiddish? Noach. In English, Noach. And since Noach is mentioned twice, this is how it went. Noach, 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 Noach. So we had his name mentioned 6 times. But in the text it's mentioned twice. And that's a subject of discussion amongst various commentators. Now the simple meaning is, these are the generations of Noach, the offspring of Noach, and it should have just continued to give you his children's names, which it does in the next verse. So this prompts several explanations. Number one, Rashi. Rashi says that obviously there's a digression over here. It tells you that Noach was a righteous man. He was a perfectly righteous in his generations. He went in the way of God. And Noach, the next verse says, fathered 3 sons. But he could have started off by saying, these are the offspring of Noach, Shem, Cham, Yafes. So Rashi gives 2 explanations. The first is, he quotes a verse in Proverbs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. When you mention the name of a righteous person, bless him. So the Torah says, these are the children of Noach. We mention a righteous man, we have to bless him. We cannot just let the name be mentioned without telling us something about him that is favorable. And this is in stark contrast to today's world, where if you find someone who has one flaw, then that begins to define the person, although everything else about the person is righteous. That's the nature of society today. We define the person by their worst behavior or their worst traits. Noach was not perfect. Even though the Torah uses the word tamim, which is perfect, that poses a problem. He was not perfect, as we'll see later on. He did very little to avert the flood. But nevertheless, when the Torah introduces him, it doesn't tell you about his imperfections. It tells you he was a righteous man, perfectly righteous. But what about his imperfections? Why are you insistent on hearing the man's imperfections? Why can't you just live with the positive of this person? And we're living in a society, and this is a little bit of a critique that I have, where everyone tries to humanize everyone else as a way of trying to somehow say, yes, I have a lot of flaws, but I'm no worse than so-and-so. Even though that person is held in high esteem, that person isn't perfect. That's the wrong attitude. We should not try to so-called I don't even know why it's called humanizing that person. But we should not try to look for the fault to make us feel better. One of the worst traits, the Talmud says, is miskabed b'klonel shel chaveiro. If you feel honored because your friend was degraded, don't feel honor because of someone else's lowliness. Feel honor because you rose to the occasion. Rather than putting someone else down to make you tall, stand up higher, and that way you'll be tall. So that's one explanation. Noach is mentioned, so the Torah praises him, tells you he was a righteous man, and then goes on to tell you about his kids. Second explanation Rashi gives, that no, it's not a digression at all. This teaches us that what are the main offspring of a righteous person, not his physical children, but his spiritual children, his good deeds. So the Torah says, these are the offspring of Noach. What are they? His righteousness. That's what really is what represents Noach's offspring. And the reason why this is more so than one's physical offspring is because physical offspring are not immortal. Your good deeds are immortal. You often hear the eulogizers at funerals talk about how memories last forever. No, they don't. That's an outright distortion of reality. Memories do not last forever. Of course, memories are incredibly important, but they don't last forever. Life is not forever, except in the Messianic age. That will bring life to eternal existence. But right now, life is not forever, and memories are not forever. But your good deeds, they are forever. They last way beyond your children's generation and your grandchildren's generation. So that's what the Torah is trying to tell us here. Then there's another totally different kind of interpretation given by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev. I'm mentioning his interpretation partly because it was last week that we celebrated his yahrzeit, the anniversary of his passing, just a few days ago. So it's an appropriate thing to mention one of his interpretations. He says the word Noach has a meaning. It means peace, tranquility, serenity, joy, delight. It says, what is a person's reason to be happy when he is doing or she is doing something righteous? You're doing a mitzvah. Why are you Noach? Again, translating Noach as filled with delight. It's because Noach, because you gave God delight. And this can be applied also to human beings. What should be your greatest pleasure in doing something good for someone else? It's the pleasure that they receive. So this goes both ways. It's God's pleasure and the pleasure that others receive. It's the pleasure that you give to the whole world. Every time you do a mitzvah, you bring pleasure to God and to humanity and to the whole world. Okay, goes on to say he was a righteous person, perfect in his generations. So Rashi immediately quotes a dispute of the Talmud. What does the Torah mean when it says he was righteous in his generations? Couldn't it just say he was? So some of them interpret this in a positive way, some interpret it in a negative way. The positive is, imagine how great he would have been if he had lived in a time of righteous people. He lived amongst a generation of horrible criminals. So he stood out because he was, in fact, he could have become like them, and he didn't. That makes him unique. Imagine how much greater he would have been had he lived in a good environment. That's the praise. There are others who say no, on the contrary. In contrast with the people amongst whom he lived, who were horrible people, he was a righteous guy. But if he would have lived in the generation of Abraham, Abraham would have outshined him. Abraham would have eclipsed him entirely. He would have been a nothing. So the Rebbe once asked, and actually he asked this question several times, and he gave several different answers, why would the Torah be interested in putting him down? I just finished saying, and that's not my saying, it's the Torah that says it. Torah praises him. He's a perfect tzaddik, perfectly righteous. Why would the Torah want to hint, although it's not explicit, but it's a hint, qualifying it. It's not, he wasn't as great as you might think. Why would anyone want to go out of their way to denigrate him after the Torah just promoted his greatness? So the Rebbe says that when you promote someone's virtue and greatness, there's a little bit of a danger there. Because if you're talking about a person who is phenomenally great, but has one flaw, you might think, well, it's lock, stock, and barrel. I have to emulate that person, because that's why we look up to people to use them as role models. So I'm going to emulate that person in toto. I'm going to emulate his good traits as well as his flaws. After all, it's a package deal. No. Torah says it's not a package deal. Noah had one flaw, and as we'll see, that flaw was that he did very little to change the hearts and minds of the people who would later on perish in the flood. It was his responsibility to do that. That's why God told him to build an ark. Noach was not a young man. He was not a spring chicken. He was 500 years old. It took him 120 years to build that ark. During that time, he could have influenced at least a minion he could have had, but he had no one. Except for his immediate family, everyone else perished. That's a stain on Noach's otherwise very beautiful record. So one should know that, yes, he's perfect tzaddik. We should emulate his righteousness, resist the temptation to be like everyone, not to be influenced by the evil people of your time. But don't learn that one negative lesson from him. Don't emulate his detachment from the world and not trying to save him. Okay, so Noach now is the father of 3 sons, and the world becomes corrupted, and the world is now going to be destroyed with a flood. What did they do wrong? So the Torah implies, although it doesn't say clearly everything they did wrong, but the way Rashi explains, when it says they became corrupt, the word corruption refers to 2 types of sins: idol worship and sexual immorality. Those were the 2 things that literally caused the world's destruction. But then the Torah uses the word, it does describe one sin in verse 11, Vatimole haaretz chamas, and the earth was filled with chamas. What does chamas mean? Or someone pronounce it chamas. It means robbery, theft. So Rashi says, after they committed the heinous crimes of idol worship and sexual immorality, God was still not going to punish them. The punishment, the seal, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, was robbery. What was wrong with their robbery? There are many interpretations. I'll just share one. The Talmud says that they actually were very reluctant to violate the laws of robbery. So what they did is they would steal less than a pruta. Pruta is the smallest denomination in olden days, copper coin, like a penny today, maybe a nickel. And they would make sure to rob very small, insignificant amounts, but from a lot of people. In other words, their type of theft was one where you don't see a victim. It's like someone who goes into a Walmart and steals a piece of whatever it is worth $1. You go into a dollar store and you take something that's worth $1 that they probably paid 10 cents for, and you think, who did I harm? I lost. These are multi-billionaires. A loss of $1 means nothing to them. Yes, but in the aggregate, if everyone does that, then they're out of business. But even if you're the only one who did it, you see, that's the difference between secular ethics and Jewish ethics. In secular ethical works, they would tell you that if one person does it, is it unethical? Well, if everyone would copy you, it would cause a major destructive force. If everyone stole $1 worth of material from a multi-billion-dollar corporation, they would go out of business. Then it's unethical for even one person to do it. Judaism says no, it's much more than that. Even if no one else in the world would do it, you're the only shoplifter in the world, and the multi-billionaire would never even miss it, and no one is going to catch you, no one is going to do anything about it, it's just as immoral as if everyone in the world did it. It's intrinsically immoral. Now, there is an argument of the slippery slope. If you justify $1, then you can justify $2, and then you destroy the whole world. That's what was wrong with those people. They tried to find ways of doing something immoral in a legal way. And if you want to extend this, you can see that every immoral leader, tyrant, dictator, tried to find ways of making the evil that they were doing legal. The Nazis had the Nuremberg laws. The communists would torture you to sign a confession that you committed a crime. If they're already torturing you, they could have signed the confession themselves or punish you without the confession. But they had to do it legally, quote-unquote legally. That's the way evil gets done. Because most people will not do overt evil, but if they can somehow cushion it with something that makes it sound legal, that gives them the feeling of comfort. I'm doing everything legally. This is the law. So anyhow, that's the point over here, that yes, they were immoral in many ways, but when God saw how they were undermining the stability of society by justifying theft, when they committed other crimes, they didn't justify it, they just followed their temptations. But here they were trying to justify it, and that was worse. That's one interpretation. Then, when the waters came down, the Torah says that Noah had to almost be pushed into the ark. If you look at verse 7, Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives with him went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Now those words are unnecessary. We know that he went into the ark because of the flood. He didn't go into the ark for any other reason. So why does the Torah add that? So Rashi says something very strange, that Noach was one of the small believers. He believed, but he didn't quite believe. Seems another flaw of Noach, that he was not such a great believer. He believed, but he didn't believe that the flood waters would come. So he didn't enter the ark until the waters pushed him in. He had to wait. It's like people who don't evacuate when there's a hurricane. They wait for the last minute if they can still get out in time. Well, he didn't believe quite that there would be a flood, and therefore the waters had to push him into the ark. Until the waters came, he didn't go into the ark. Now, isn't that a little strange? We just got finished talking about him, that he was a perfectly righteous man, and his one flaw was that he didn't do anything to change people's hearts, but now it seems that he had a much bigger flaw. If you don't have faith in God, or your faith is somehow compromised, that's pretty big. That doesn't make you into a perfect tzaddik, a perfectly righteous person. So one of the interpretations is that it's not that he didn't believe that God could bring a flood, or that God would bring the flood if God so wanted. What he couldn't believe was, would God really want to destroy the world? Would God really not show compassion, and maybe he was just threatening the world because he wanted them to change, but he really didn't mean it? How many times does a parent tell the kid, if you do this, the consequences will be that, and although it's not right, because the child will never trust the parent, but the parent never goes through with the threat of consequences made. So he really couldn't believe that God, who's filled with compassion, would do such a drastic thing to bring destruction to the whole world. So he believed, yes, because God said it would happen, but he didn't quite believe. So that's why he had to be pushed into the ark. Then he knew it was real, that it was coming. Now, the waters of the flood were horrible. It destroyed all of humanity except for the people in the ark, all of the animal life, all the plant life, and even the earth itself was scraped off. It was total devastation and destruction. Now, if God wanted to destroy the world, he didn't have to bring a flood. He could have just said people should disappear. He could have sent down a fire. It could have just consumed everyone instantaneously. God can do everything, of course. Why did he need this whole elaborate look? If you had to make a movie out of it, it would be a very short movie if it was just one bolt of lightning that destroyed the whole earth. So maybe for the movie, the eventual movie, God had to do it this way. But in Hasidic literature, we're told that the waters of the flood were actually not just destructive, they were also purifying. The whole concept of a mikveh, that we immerse ourselves in a special pool called a mikveh, is based on the waters of the flood. The world had to be purified. Excuse me, a mikveh has to be a pool consisting of a certain measure of water, and the way it's measured is by the measure called a sa'ah, and it has to be 40 of them. The number 40 is a significant number. The flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. 40 is a significant number, as I'll soon explain what its significance is. We find that Moses was on the mountain to get the tablets 40 days. And many other areas in Jewish history and Jewish life where the number 40 is mentioned. 40, it says in Ethics of the Fathers, is the age of Bina, of understanding. What is the significance of 40? The Talmud gives us a hint to it when it says that it takes 40 days before the embryo becomes a viable embryo. In other words, it's no longer just fluid, as the Talmud puts it, but its gender was already determined at the age of 40 days, which is about 6 weeks. That's universally accepted. That 40 days is what gives you your basic form. So at the time of conception, there's just a potential. When does that potential acquire its basic form, not its complete form, its basic form at the end of 40 days? When does a person develop a basic structure of understanding? At the age of 40. Of course, everyone is different. Some people never get it even when they're 90. Some people get it a little earlier. But 40 is the symbol of developing a basic structure, not the complete structure, but a basic structure. Anyone who finishes their development, intellectual development, at 40, that's not what the point is. The point is 40 is when you begin. That's when life really begins. Because that's when you develop your fundamental structure. Up until then, you're just groping in the dark, so to speak. That's why purification is a process where there's a rebirth of something, where the world requires a new structure, a new paradigm. This is what happened at the flood, a paradigm shift. The world is now changing its whole course, at least the potential for it. That didn't mean that the world was going to become a perfect world, because as we'll soon see, not too long after the flood, in historical terms, they create this tower, a rebellious tower that God had to confound and thwart their plans, which we'll talk about a little later if we have time. But the flood gave the world a new paradigm. It's a purification process. Not only is it a purification process, it's also a metaphor for the future Messianic age, about which the prophet Isaiah says the whole world will be deluged with the water of knowledge. It will be like a sea of knowledge. So the waters of Noah are a portent of the future. And therefore, they're not really just negative, destructive forces. They are purifying forces. Unfortunately, the purification that happened then was at the expense of the lives of all these horrible people. But the symbol of purification is a very positive symbol. But we're also given another metaphor. The flood is also a metaphor for the turbulent waters and chaotic existence that many people have to live through in order to survive. In English they call it the rat race, but it's the efforts that people have to expend to earn a living. Now life has become so much simpler, even though we're still, some people can't cope with all the pressures of life. But imagine how life was like 200 years ago when you had to chop wood to get to cook some breakfast. If you had no plumbing, you had no electricity, you had no vehicles, you had to take a horse to get from one city to another, which takes us an hour, which would take you a day. And all the difficulties involved in producing food and earning a living, that distracts you totally from your spiritual quest. A human being, is only a mortal, and it's very hard to balance these different goals, the goal of survival and the goal of spiritual growth. So there's a verse that King Solomon uses, that the turbulent waters will not extinguish the love. That even when a person is totally immersed in the rat race, is trying to earn a living, they have the ability to maintain a spiritual life. The waters of Noah eventually are described as waters that brought fulfillment and tranquility to God. When a person, the Alter Rebbe in his work called Torah Or explains that when a person who does not live in a spiritual environment, but has to work very hard, and they spend a few minutes a day praying, studying Torah, their prayer and their Torah study has more value than the Torah study and prayer of someone who is steeped in Judaism, steeped in spirituality. And that's what these waters are. They're called Mei Noach, the waters of Noah, which also could be translated as the waters of ultimate delight. This is what causes God the greatest delight, when a person is able to take off time from whatever else they're doing to have a spiritual life. In the ark, the Torah tells us that Noah had to work very hard. He had to feed all the animals. And the Torah hints, and this is the way Rashi explains it, that Noach was diminished. He was in a very, very bad shape because of the hard work that he had to do. This is in chapter 7, verse 24. It says, Vayishor ach Noach. Only Noah survived, and those with him in the ark. So Rashi says, what does it mean that only Noah survived? It should have said Noah survived with those who with him in the ark. Obviously, he would know he was the only one. So Rashi quotes a midrash that says that Noach himself was diminished. He was coughing blood because of all the hard work that he had to feed the animals. Then he quotes another midrash that one day he delayed feeding the lion, and the lion took a swing at him and caused him to become diminished. So the Rebbe explains that there's a lesson in this. We have to learn some lesson. The lesson is how much a Jew is required to devote himself to others, even at one's own expense. Even if one has to compromise their health, a Jew is required to devote himself totally to others, to doing God's will. However, never impose that on another person. You can impose that on yourself, but for the others, you don't delay. You don't skimp on what you give others. Others, you give them as much of what they need. The Talmud says that charity, when you help a poor person, let's say the poor person was once living comfortably, had a comfortable job, not filthy rich, but they were comfortable, and they came on bad times, and now they only they're starving. They have nothing to eat. So a person could think that the community, which is made up of individuals who contribute to a general fund, is responsible for these poor people to feed them. Well, what should you feed them? Basic food, basic sustenance. Make sure they have a roof over their head, they're not homeless. Make sure they have some basic clothing. But what happens if they were accustomed to a much more comfortable lifestyle? The Talmud says, and I know people are going to find this strange, that the obligation of charity, of tzedakah, is to give them as much as they need to restore them to their original standard of living. Now, of course, the community has limited funds, so we can't do that at the expense of other poor people. But assuming they have enough money, you can't just say, I am just going to let you live on the bare basics. There's a story told of a very wealthy man coming to a rabbi, and he says, Rabbi, I want to tell you something. You know, I'm very, very rich. I can afford the most expensive gourmet foods, but I eat just very basic bread and some dry, maybe a piece of fish, some few vegetables. I don't eat any gourmet foods. I never eat out, going to expensive restaurants, because I'm an ascetic in spite of my wealth. And the rabbi said, no, you have to eat gourmet foods and spend money like it's going out of style on your food and all the other things that you have. Rabbi, why? Don't you always teach us that we shouldn't be indulged? We should be a little bit more, ascetic? He says, I'll tell you why. If you would eat gourmet food and spend a lot of money, and a poor man comes to you and says, I don't have anything to live on, you would think to yourself, obviously I'm not going to give him these expensive steaks, $100 steaks and $200 bottle of wine, and have him dine in one of these fancy restaurants. But you know what I'll give him? I'll give him a good meal, some nice chicken and, some potato kugel or whatever else. A nice, decent, good, satisfying meal that he'll really enjoy. He says, but if you eat this just plain meal, and a poor man will come to you and say, well, obviously I can't let him eat like I do. What is he going to have left? Pebbles and dirt? Because that's how people are. They always feel that they have to give, but that person doesn't have to be at the level that I'm at. They can be a little bit less. And that's why we have to learn the lesson that no, we never make the same demands of others as we make of ourselves. If we have hardship, don't impose that on someone else. On the contrary, give them even what you don't have. And that's the ultimate approach to life. Certainly don't feel that they don't deserve any more. Let them suffer a little just like you suffered. Okay, now the flood is over, and the bird that he sends, the Yonah, the dove, comes back eventually with a olive leaf. You ever thought of it that in modern times and ancient times, what was the symbol of peace? An olive branch. Where did that come from? Some people suggest it may have come from this story. The bird brings back an olive branch, which demonstrates that the world is now at peace. Whether or not that's the source of it, but it's interesting that that is what we see over here. But Rashi gives another explanation why there's an olive branch. Olives are bitter. And the dove was saying, I'd rather work for a living, even under bitter conditions, but be self-sufficient, rather than getting it from someone else, even if it's as sweet as honey. What you yourself accomplish for your own sustenance is worth more than something that someone else gives you that is sweet. That's the lesson. What is the obvious lesson over here? Don't put your trust in other people. The psalmist says that. Al tiftechu v'nedivim. Don't trust humans, because they may promise you honey, but you need to get what you get from God, even if it seems bitter. And another lesson is, in our Judaism, we sometimes can get a lot from being in the company of others, learning from others, and that's of course encouraged. But the greatest benefit a person gets is when they struggle themselves. There was originally, when the Hasidic movement started, there were two schools of thought. One school of thought was that the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, the holy man, he will reach high levels, and being in his presence, he will bestow upon the people high spiritual levels. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, disagreed with that, and he said, no. What you can do on your own is worth more, a lot more than what can be given to you by others. Yes, you need a Rebbe to inspire you, to educate you, to guide you, but ultimately you cannot rely on someone else to reach high spiritual levels, and you just bask in their presence. You have to do it on your own. Now, at the end of the flood, Rashi intimates that they didn't want to leave the ark. If you look in chapter 8, in verse 17, so Rashi says there, tell them to leave. If they don't want to leave, take them out. What's going on over here? Why wouldn't they want to leave? So a psychologist would probably come up with a very psychological explanation that they were traumatized by this event. Imagine that. We're living in an ark for a year, even though the flood lasted for 40 days. That's the rain and the fountains, but the water stayed there for a full year. You were traumatized, living in that, cooped up in that one little boat with all the animals of the world, no sunlight, no daylight. You would be traumatized, and you wouldn't be able to, you would be catatonic. You couldn't leave. But that's a psychological explanation. Take it for what it's worth. But there's a spiritual explanation. The ark was not just a place to save yourself from the waters. It was a model of the future. Look what happened. You had all the animals. You had lions and tigers and bears and snakes and every destructive creature in the world. And you had humans among them, and no one ate anyone else. The animals did not devour one another. They certainly didn't hurt the people, although the lion did give a little swing at Noah when he delayed his food. But he did not harm any of the people otherwise, and neither did he eat other animals. They were fed, obviously, vegetation. So that was a model of the future. Everyone knows the verse that the wolf will lie with the lamb. People misquote that as the lion will live with the lamb. Right after that, it says the lion will eat, vegetation just like cattle. Will eat straw, whatever vegetation. But the wolf will lie with the lamb. That's the traditional. Lions, I don't think, eat that many lambs. Wolves like lambs, so the wolf and the lamb will get along. That was already there in that ark. So they were, and it's not just a physical thing. There was a spiritual energy in that ark that was a model of the future. Why would you want to leave that? Of course, God said, no, this is a model of the future. It's not the future. Get out. And this idea that sometimes we live in the future prematurely, that was a mistake that many people made. Adam made that mistake. Adam was told not to eat of the forbidden fruit. According to one opinion, it was the grapevine. The Midrash says, had he waited 3 hours after that commandment, it would have been Shabbos. He would have been allowed to squeeze the grapes into wine and drink it for Kiddush. But he did it prematurely. Noah came out of the ark, and what did he plant? A vineyard. And he got drunk, and he was exposed, and he was humiliated, and he had to curse his son for exposing him and humiliating him, and it caused a lot of strife. all because he planted a vineyard. What was going on in Noah's mind? Again, in his mind, he said, okay, Adam did it prematurely, but now we have a new world. The world is ready for drinking l'chaim. And the world was not ready yet. He should have been engaged in rebuilding the world, Rashi says, rather than planting a vineyard. So very many times people see the future. Korach rebelled against Moses. Why did he rebel? Didn't he realize that he's starting up with fire, playing with fire? No, he saw the future. And the future, he saw that the Levi will be higher than the Kohen. And therefore, as a Levi, he felt he was already living in that future. No, he saw the future, but he wasn't living yet in the future. That's a pattern you'll find many other times in the Torah. And that's what happened here with the people. They didn't want to go out of the ark because they had the future. God says, no, you have to make the future before you could enjoy it permanently. I'm giving you a model of it, but you will have to work for it. So what happens after the flood? There's a midrash that says that Noach got angry and he complained to God. And he says, God, where's your compassion? He saw the devastation of the world. He says, where's your compassion? But God had a good comeback. To be God, you have to be a little smarter than the people you created. And God says, where were you before the flood? When I told you to speak to the people, show them the right way, get them to change. I gave you 120 years to do it, and you failed. And now you're complaining about compassion? Where were you? That's a very powerful lesson to all of us. When we complain about what God does and what he doesn't do, and the complaints are not all bad, because God wants us to pray to him and argue with him as Abraham did. But there's another side to it as well. What did we do? Because God put us here with a mission, and we can't just put everything on God. He has broad shoulders, he can take it. But we have to do the things that we complain God should have done for us. Then we get to the generation of the Tower of Babel. That's a very enigmatic story, but I'll try to make it brief. They were trying to build a city and a tower to be unified. They spoke one language. They wanted unity. Isn't that a beautiful thing? And what does God do? He causes them to be dispersed, confuses them, confounds them. They no longer speak each other's language. From there we have all the different nations of the world, and from there we have all the strife that exists to this very day, where nation cannot get along with nation. God causes it and confounds those who try to create unity. Isn't that strange? Why would God want to undo the unity? So the obvious answer is because unity and peace is wonderful, but the motives and the goal has to be for the right reason. Communism, the worst evil in human history, maybe second to Nazism, but communism preaches unity. We're all one. We're all equal. And in the name of equality, they murdered tens of millions of innocent people. That shows you that you have to be very wary of people who preach peace when the objective and the goal is not desirable. Not that conflict and strife is positive, but the wrong type of peace could even be more destructive. And that's why God confounded them. But on a deeper level, the Tower of Babel refers to literature. Because the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, which is one of the earliest works of Kabbalah and Hebrew grammar, authored by Abraham, the patriarch Abraham in our tradition. This book says that every letter is like a brick. So what happens when you put together a lot of bricks? You have a house. So every word is a house. because every word houses an idea. Now, if you string a lot of words together, you get a street, a whole street of houses. You put a lot of streets together, you get a chapter, and a lot of chapters, you get a city. You get a neighborhood, you get a city. So when you talk about they wanted to build a city, that's a book. And this book was there for self-promotion. Let's make this tower, this book will become a bestseller. It will be on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months. And this will make us famous, then we'll make a movie out of our book, and then we will become immortalized. That's the secular notion of literature. It's all about self-expression, so we can become more famous and reach the stars. That's the secular version of the Tower of Babel, and that God says, no, I cannot allow this to happen. On the other hand, there's a parallel, a holy parallel. Where do we find a book that promotes unity? That's the work of Maimonides. His Mishnah Torah was written to unify everyone. When you study Talmud, if you're not a scholar, it's off limits. Even scholars are in so many different levels of understanding. That's true about almost every other work. So while they're Torah and they're holy, they're not unifying. Rambam is a unified work. And that unity is the spiritual antidote for the negative unity of all the different isms of the world that give us the false forms of unity and all the false literature that tries to edify us. I once read someone saying, all the problems of the world can be solved if we just read more books. Nothing can be farther from the truth. Reading books does not make you a better person. What makes you a better person is reading the right books and having the right education. But you can read a lot of books. The Nazis, the Germans read a lot of books. They were the most advanced people in literature and science and humanities and every area of knowledge. They were the top. But that didn't make them better people. It made them worse people. Doctors were murderers. Pediatricians were murdering Jewish children. It has nothing to do with reading books. It's reading the right books. You read a book that gives you the understanding of the greatness of God. You build a tower to get closer to God, a spiritual tower, in a way that unifies people. That brings us closer to Mashiach, to the final redemption. And that explains why the Rebbe so strongly emphasized the study of Rambam, of Maimonides' Code of Law, because that's a equalizing element. That's a real city, a unified city, a tower that is the opposite of Babel, that brings clarity and unity to the Jewish people. Have a good week, a good Shabbos, and God willing, we'll try to continue this next week.